Turn off your sprinklers or I'll call the cops. Karen, that's my water line you tapped into. It's community property. I can use what I want. Yep. That was my welcome to the neighborhood. Karen shrieking at me, while standing ankle-deep in the water, she illegally redirected straight onto my lawn. Smash that like button if you've ever had a neighbor mistake your property for theirs. Subscribe for more tales where HOA tyrants drown in their own nonsense. Because what this woman didn't know? My background in environmental engineering meant I had a very specific kind of revenge planned, and her dream home was about to become the neighborhood's newest swamp attraction. It began on a Tuesday morning, one of those quiet starts where the only sound was supposed to be the hum of the coffee maker and maybe a bird or two outside the window. I remember pausing mid-sip when I heard something unusual, a faint trickling that didn't belong to the usual sounds of the neighborhood. At first I thought maybe someone was washing their car early or that the sprinklers next door had been set on a timer, but when I opened my blinds my stomach dropped. A slow-moving stream was cutting across my lawn, glistening under the sun like a silver ribbon, and it was coming from the direction of Karen's house. It wasn't rainwater. There hadn't been a drop in weeks. This was something else entirely. I stepped outside to get a closer look, and the dampness hit me right away. The grass that had been dry and neatly trimmed the day before, now squished under my shoes. The smell wasn't fresh or clean either. It carried a sour edge that made me frown. The flow wasn't gentle. It was steady, persistent, the kind of stream that only stops when someone shuts off a valve. As I followed the water back toward the property line, I noticed muddy streaks carved into the soil where it had already begun eroding the ground. Neighbors were just starting to step outside to grab their newspapers, and I caught a few looks of pity mixed with amusement. They'd seen this before, though maybe not at this level. Karen had a reputation for creative landscaping choices, if that's what you wanted to call them, and this looked like her latest project. I crouched down by the fence, listening to the hiss of water under pressure, and spotted the source. A white PVC pipe, sticking out from under her hedge like a bone jutting through skin, spewed water into my yard with cheerful determination. Someone had put that there on purpose. I stood there for a long moment, watching the artificial river form on the edge of my property, and felt my jaw tighten. It wasn't an accident. No broken pipe just happens to aim perfectly into a neighbor's lawn. Someone had made the deliberate choice to send their problem downstream, and the target was me. My coffee had gone cold in my hand by then, and the morning calm had evaporated. Instead, I was left staring at the first act of what I would later call the flood wars, and Karen was about to find out I don't take kindly to sabotage dressed up as neighborly landscaping. When I crossed onto the strip of grass that bordered the property line, the evidence was so obvious it almost felt staged. The pipe behind her hedge wasn't a subtle leak or some cracked line that had burst with age. It was a crude construction that looked like it had been slapped together in the dead of night with whatever scraps were lying around in her garage. The PVC joint connected to what I quickly recognized as part of her backyard sprinkler system, rerouted with a series of elbows and couplings until the entire flow of water was shooting directly onto my lawn. It was the kind of setup you'd expect from someone who had just enough knowledge to be dangerous, but none of the skill to do it properly. The ground around the pipe was saturated, a patch of mud surrounded by a scatter of rocks she had clearly placed there in an attempt to disguise the work. The hedges had been trimmed just enough to create a little alcove, a perfect hiding place for her plumbing shortcut. The sound was almost comical, a steady gurgle and hiss that seemed far too energetic for such a petty act. Water bubbled and spat from the edges where she hadn't sealed the connections correctly, dripping onto the soil and carving grooves through the mulch. I crouched down and studied it, letting the reality sink in. Karen hadn't just let her sprinklers run too long or neglected her maintenance. She had gone out of her way to build this contraption, to design an escape route for water she didn't want pooling in her own yard, and she decided my grass was a more acceptable dumping ground. There was no way this was about gardening convenience. This was about control. Karen had always acted as though the neighborhood was her personal stage and everyone else was an extra in her performance. If she wanted a perfectly dry patio, then by her logic, someone else could deal with the runoff. As I stood there with mud creeping into the soles of my shoes, I realized just how calculated this was. The pipe was angled precisely so the strongest flow cut across the middle of my yard, rather than harmlessly draining toward the street. She hadn't left it to chance. Every drop was aimed like an arrow, and I was the target. The arrogance of it was staggering, and I knew immediately this wasn't going to be a simple fix. Karen had declared her own kind of water war, and the battlefield was my property. Karen's reputation in the neighborhood had been built over years of small victories that only she seemed to celebrate. She wasn't just a homeowner. She was the self-appointed guardian of every mailbox, flower bed, and trash can placement on the block. People whispered her name with a mix of irritation and fear, as though invoking her too loudly might summon a fresh wave of violation notices. She carried herself with the kind of confidence you only see in people who believe they are untouchable. Her laminated HOA handbook, always tucked under her arm or resting in her car seat, had become her weapon of choice. She would flip through it with practiced flair, pausing dramatically before declaring a neighbor guilty of some obscure line no one else had ever read. To her, the rules weren't guidelines. They were scripture, binding and absolute, yet somehow only enforceable in the directions she chose. She ignored her own chipped shutters while demanding that others repaint theirs. She lectured families about lawn length while her backyard jungle crept further into the alley. The sheer hypocrisy might have been funny if it didn't carry such real consequences. People paid fines, endured harassment, and kept their heads down to avoid her wrath. She thrived on that silence. Every time a neighbor muttered but didn't fight back, her authority grew. She became the golden girl of the HOA, not because she was beloved, but because she was relentless. Board members stopped questioning her complaints, accepting her word as fact to avoid her tirades. She had turned the HOA into her personal court, a place where she was both accuser and judge, leaving everyone else scrambling to stay out of the defendant's chair. Standing at the edge of my flooded yard, I understood that her pipe wasn't just plumbing, it was an extension of her power play. She believed she could shape the neighborhood itself, rerouting nature to suit her vision. If water bothered her foundation, she had no qualms about sending it to ruin mine. She didn't expect resistance because no one else had dared challenge her. That smug confidence, the certainty that her word was law, explained why she thought she could get away with drowning my lawn. To Karen, this wasn't sabotage. It was simply another ruling in her endless campaign to control everything within sight of her porch. By the third day, the damage to my yard was impossible to ignore. The grass, which had been a healthy green when I moved in, now looked like it had been dragged through a storm that never ended. Patches of yellow spread across the lawn where the roots had suffocated under constant saturation. The flower beds I had worked on my first weekend in the house were collapsing, the soil spilling onto the driveway in muddy rivulets. Every time I stepped outside, my shoes sank deeper into the muck, leaving behind prints that filled with standing water as soon as I pulled my foot free. The driveway had become a shallow channel, guiding the runoff down toward the street, but the sheer volume of water meant the flow never stopped. It carried mulch, small rocks, and clumps of grass with it, leaving streaks that hardened into ugly trails once the sun dried the top layer. My porch, which I had imagined as a peaceful place to drink coffee in the mornings, now smelled faintly of mildew. The air itself carried a damp heaviness that clung to everything, and I could hear the hum of mosquitoes even in the middle of the afternoon. Karen, meanwhile, treated the situation like a spectator sport. She would sit on her patio chair with a glass of iced tea, watching as I tried to rake soggy clumps of mulch back into place or bale water away from the base of my porch. If our eyes met, she would raise her glass in a little mock salute, as if she were proud of the chaos she had created. Her posture made it clear she didn't see this as a problem, she saw it as entertainment. At night, the situation grew worse. The water pooled in low spots, forming shallow ponds that reflected the streetlights in dull yellow. The chorus of insects grew louder, and frogs began appearing at the edges, drawn by the new wetland she had gifted me. I lay awake listening to the croaks and the buzzing, thinking about how quickly my yard had transformed from suburban calm to a swamp. It was no accident, no unfortunate coincidence. Karen had shifted her burden onto me, and she was savoring every ruined blade of grass that proved she had the upper hand. When I finally confronted her about the mess, I went in trying to keep my voice even. I pointed to the water cutting through my lawn, to the muddy streaks across my driveway and asked her directly why she thought it was acceptable to reroute her drainage onto my property. Karen didn't hesitate. She didn't stammer or show a flicker of guilt. Instead, she crossed her arms and said, with the absolute confidence of someone quoting the law, that water was community property. She spoke like a teacher, scolding a slow student, insisting that I should be grateful for her help because she was keeping my lawn from drying out. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline, but she kept going. She claimed that her rerouting system was a public service, that she was demonstrating the importance of cooperative living in a shared neighborhood. She even had the nerve to suggest that I should thank her for saving me the trouble of watering my own grass. Every word dripped with the certainty that she was in the right, and I was just another neighbor who didn't understand the privilege of living under her interpretation of HOA rules. What really got me was how she framed it as generosity. She tilted her head and smiled in that condescending way, telling me not to worry because she knew best. In her mind, the constant flooding was not sabotage. It was maintenance. She was presenting her sabotage as charity, dressing up her selfishness in the language of community care. I asked her if she realized what the standing water was doing to my foundation, to my garden, to the usability of my porch. She waved her hand like she was brushing away a gnat and said grass grows back, soil dries, and bugs are part of the ecosystem. The tone in her voice made it clear she didn't see the destruction. She saw an opportunity to assert her control, to remind me that I lived in her kingdom and not the other way around. Walking back to my porch that day, shoes caked in mud, I realized there would be no reasoning with her. Karen's justification wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding, it was her worldview. She had taken ownership of my property in her head, and every drop of water pouring into my yard was her way of reminding me exactly who she thought was in charge. I filed a formal complaint with the HOA, thinking that surely this was the sort of violation they were created to handle. I put together photos of the waterlogged grass, the ruined flower beds, and even a short video showing the pipe gushing directly from her yard into mine. I attached everything to the online portal and waited, half expecting an immediate response promising swift action. Instead, I got a polite form letter acknowledging my complaint and assuring me that the matter would be reviewed at the next monthly meeting. That meeting was 3 weeks away. Frustrated, I called the office directly. The HOA secretary answered in a weary tone that made it clear she had been dealing with homeowners all morning. I explained the situation, emphasizing that this wasn't a minor landscaping issue but actual property damage. She listened quietly before sighing and telling me that Karen had been a member in good standing for more than 15 years. She suggested I try to resolve things directly with her before escalating to a formal hearing. In other words, the HOA had no intention of stepping in. I asked if rerouting water into a neighbor's yard wasn't a violation of basic property rights. The secretary paused, shuffled some papers, and then said that each situation was unique and required context. It was the kind of bureaucratic answer that didn't commit to anything. The more she spoke, the more obvious it became that the board wasn't going to risk upsetting Karen. She had entrenched herself too deeply in their good graces, attending every meeting, volunteering for committees, and inserting herself into every minor decision. She was their star player, and no one wanted to challenge her. When I hung up, I felt a strange mix of anger and clarity. The HOA wasn't a safety net. It was a shield for Karen's behavior. She had built her reputation so thoroughly that even obvious misconduct would be brushed aside. They saw her as an asset to the community rather than the bully she actually was. Looking out at my flooded yard, I realized I was on my own. The system that was supposed to provide balance had chosen its side, and it wasn't mine. Karen had the board wrapped around her finger, and my evidence meant nothing to people who were too scared or too comfortable to challenge her. The morning it all reached a breaking point began quietly enough. I stepped outside with my coffee, still hoping the flow might have slowed overnight, but instead I was greeted by the unmistakable squelch of waterlogged ground. My yard was no longer a yard at all. It had turned into a shallow pond that stretched from the porch steps to the property line. The grass had disappeared under a film of murky water, and what little soil was left seemed determined to follow it downhill. I tried to find a dry spot to stand, but every step sank me deeper until the water rose above my ankles. The smell hit me next. It wasn't just wet earth or standing rain. This was sharper, fouler, with an edge that made me pull back instinctively. I crouched down and noticed the cloudy swirls in the water, streaks of gray and brown that didn't belong. At that moment, I understood the truth. This wasn't only excess sprinkler water. Karen had connected her sump pump, draining the refuse from her own basement directly into my property. She hadn't just inconvenienced me. She had turned my lawn into her private waste pit. I stood there with the sour air filling my nose and felt something shift inside me. It was no longer about grass or flowers or even the annoyance of her smug, tea-drinking presence. This was damage that could rot wood, weaken my foundation, and make my home unsafe. It was calculated and cruel, a deliberate transfer of her problem onto me. Later that afternoon, I spotted Karen on her porch. She leaned against the railing, sipping her drink, smiling as if nothing was wrong. When our eyes met, she raised her glass in mock cheer and called out something about how healthy my lawn looked. My hands tightened around the rake I was holding, but I didn't shout back. The rage burned too deep for words. That night, I lay awake, listening to the sound of frogs croaking in the new pools that had formed by the porch. Every noise seemed amplified, every drip a reminder of how far this had gone. I realized I wasn't just living next to a difficult neighbor. I was living next to someone who believed destroying another person's home was a perfectly acceptable solution to her own problems. I reached a point where waiting for the HOA or hoping Karen might come to her senses felt useless. If anything was going to change, it had to come from me. That night, after the neighborhood quieted and porch lights flickered out one by one, I slipped outside with a flashlight and a tool bag. The air was cool and damp, carrying the faint hum of crickets, but all I could focus on was the steady gurgle of water seeping through the pipe. It was relentless, a mocking soundtrack to her arrogance, and I intended to silence it in my own way. Moving carefully, I made my way to the corner of her property where the pipe poked out from behind the hedge. The soil was soggy, swallowing my shoes with each step, but I pressed forward. My hands tightened on the wrench I carried, its weight reassuring against the unease of creeping around in the dark. I knew that if Karen spotted me, she would scream trespassing before I even opened my mouth, but the risk didn't matter anymore. I crouched low, shining the flashlight just enough to study the setup without giving myself away. The system was even worse than I had realized. Pipes twisted in clumsy angles, sealed with globs of adhesive that had already begun to crack. Whoever had put it together knew the bare minimum about plumbing, and cared only that the water was redirected away from their own foundation. I steadied my breath and began turning the bolts, loosening connections one by one until the pipe sagged under its own weight. The sound shifted from a steady rush to a sputtering cough, and I redirected the flow with a small length of tubing I had brought with me. Instead of cutting across my yard, the water now looped back toward her property, feeding into the natural slope of her lawn. Gravity would do the rest. I tightened the last connection and stepped back, wiping my hands on my jeans as the first trickle of redirected water began pooling against her garden bed. Standing there in the quiet, I felt a surge of grim satisfaction. I wasn't destroying anything. I was simply returning the problem to where it belonged. For the first time in weeks, I could imagine waking up to a dry porch. Karen wanted a water war, and she had just lost her opening advantage. When I examined the setup more closely in daylight, the full scope of Karen's scheme revealed itself. The pipe I had seen at night wasn't a single mistake patched together with leftover parts. It was an entire system that sprawled beneath the hedge like a hidden creature, a network of mismatched fittings and cracked joints feeding from one source. At the far end of the line, tucked behind a wooden panel she had painted to match her fence, was the point of connection. It wasn't her garden hose. It wasn't her backyard spigot. It was the neighborhood water main. The realization hit like a punch. She had cut into a line that was supposed to serve every house on the block, carving out her own private escape route without permission or oversight. The pipe jutted from the main at an awkward angle, sealed with layers of tape and adhesive that looked ready to burst under pressure. It was so sloppy that I wondered how it hadn't already caused a leak big enough to alert the city. The fittings quivered slightly each time the water surged, and the hiss of pressure escaping through hairline cracks gave the whole contraption a dangerous edge. Standing there, I couldn't decide what was worse, the arrogance of tampering with a shared utility, or the sheer recklessness of doing it with such incompetence. One wrong twist, one spike in pressure, and the entire neighborhood could lose water for days. Yet Karen had hidden it under a flimsy board, as if covering her tracks with a coat of paint was enough to make the problem disappear. I crouched closer, studying the bolts and the direction of the flow, and felt a chill settle over me. This wasn't just about her draining into my yard. She had compromised the system itself, taking what she wanted with no concern for the risks. It explained her smug confidence, her dismissive attitude when I complained. She believed no one would ever discover it, and if they did, she would find a way to twist the blame. I stood up slowly, dirt clinging to my knees, and looked back at my flooded lawn. This was no longer a petty neighbor dispute. This was evidence of an illegal connection that could bring serious consequences. Karen had turned her greed into a pipeline, and she had aimed it directly at me. My background had always been something I kept to myself. Most people in the neighborhood knew me as the quiet newcomer who minded his own business. But before moving here, I had spent years working as an environmental engineer. I had designed drainage systems for towns, restored wetlands after floods, and studied how water could be redirected safely when people's homes were at risk. So, when I looked at Karen's crude piping, I didn't just see a nuisance. I saw an opportunity. She had started a game on my property, but she had no idea she was playing against someone who understood every angle of water flow better than she ever could. That night I sat at my kitchen table, sketching diagrams on the back of old envelopes, mapping out how gravity would handle the heavy lifting if I gave it the right nudge. Karen thought she had control because she had forced her problem onto me, but control is an illusion when you are working against the natural slope of the land. Water will always find its path, and all I had to do was guide it home. I gathered the tools I had collected over the years, the kind of equipment that looked ordinary enough to anyone else but held the precision of a professional's kit. Wrenches, connectors, tubing, and clamps, all packed into a box that I carried like a mechanic preparing for a tune-up. Under the cover of darkness, I returned to the hedge, where her system hissed and gurgled, crouched low, and set to work with the calm focus of someone who knows exactly what he is doing. Piece by piece, I loosened her fittings, adjusted the angles, and added my own attachments. It wasn't sabotage in the destructive sense. I didn't break anything. I simply restructured it, so the water she had stolen and redirected would follow the slope back toward her own yard. My adjustments were precise, neat, and sturdy, the opposite of her slapdash construction. When I finished, I stood back and listened. The hiss had softened, replaced by a steady, redirected flow heading exactly where it should have gone from the beginning. My lawn was free, and her garden was about to learn a hard lesson. For the first time since the flooding began, I felt like I had taken back control. Karen had opened a battle she thought she could win, but she had chosen the wrong opponent. The next morning, I stood at my window, sipping coffee, waiting to see if my adjustments had worked. The early sun cast a pale light across the neighborhood, and for the first time in weeks, my lawn looked dry. The ground still bore scars from the flooding, patches of mud and flattened grass, but the river that once cut through it had disappeared. I stepped outside, testing the soil with the toe of my shoe, and felt a spark of satisfaction when it held firm. The silence where there had once been constant trickling felt like victory. Then, just as I had hoped, the first signs of trouble appeared across the property line. Karen stormed out onto her patio, her slippers splashing in puddles that hadn't been there before. She froze, scanning the ground with a look of disbelief, and then crouched down to touch the water that had begun to creep across her carefully arranged flower bed. The smug calm she had shown during my suffering was gone. In its place was confusion and growing panic. Her garden, once the pride of her weekend hours, had turned into a soggy mess. Decorative stones that lined her walkway were half submerged. A small fountain she displayed like a trophy gurgled in protest as water pooled around its base. She bent down and examined the soil, muttering to herself in frustration, completely unaware that I could hear every word. The sound carried over the still air, complaints about how the ground wasn't draining and how her patio seemed suspiciously damp. I leaned against my porch railing and pretended to check my phone, all the while watching her fume. Every few minutes, she darted back into her house, only to return with towels, buckets, or tools she clearly didn't know how to use. Nothing helped. The water kept returning, inch by inch, following the slope back toward her foundation. For me, the moment was more than simple revenge. It was balance restored. The damage she had inflicted on me had not been erased, but at least I wasn't carrying the weight of it alone anymore. Karen was finally forced to deal with the consequences of her own reckless setup, and she didn't even realize how neatly it had all turned against her. As the days passed, the damp patch in Karen's yard grew into something she could no longer dismiss as a minor inconvenience. What had started as a few puddles near her patio turned into a creeping tide that consumed more of her carefully curated garden with each passing hour. The roses she had bragged about to anyone who would listen now drooped under the weight of waterlogged soil. The mulch she had meticulously arranged floated in loose clusters across the surface like wreckage from a storm. Even her prized bird bath leaned to one side, its base sinking into the soft ground. Neighbors began to notice. People walking their dogs slowed to glance at the spreading pools, whispering to one another before quickening their pace. Kids on bikes stopped at the curb, pointing and laughing at the way frogs had begun to appear, hopping happily through what had become a new wetland. The once perfect showcase of neighborhood order was now a curiosity, a sideshow of nature reclaiming her space. I observed it all from my porch, sipping coffee and watching the transformation unfold. It was strange how quickly the shift had happened. Only a week earlier, my property had looked like this, and Karen had reveled in my misery. Now the tables had turned, and the balance of water had chosen a new home. I didn't have to lift a finger anymore. Gravity was working in my favor. Karen, however, refused to surrender. Every morning she marched into her yard armed with rakes, buckets, and plastic sheets, convinced she could will the water away through sheer determination. She laid down boards to create walkways across the mud, spreading sand in an effort to absorb the worst spots. Each attempt failed, leaving her yard looking more chaotic than before. By evening, she was red-faced, hair plastered to her forehead, glaring at the swamp she couldn't control. The best part was the unspoken shift in power. For the first time since moving in, I felt like the neighborhood saw her differently. She wasn't the authority anymore. She was the spectacle. The golden girl of the HOA was ankle-deep in muck, fighting a losing battle against the very problem she had created. And while she flailed, I finally felt the quiet relief of a lawn returning to life. One afternoon, while I was out sweeping the last of the dried mud from my driveway, Karen finally broke. She came marching across her patio with her arms flailing and her voice cutting through the air like a siren. She accused me of sabotage, of tampering with her property, of unleashing some kind of witchcraft on her garden. Her words poured out in a shrill stream that made the dogs down the street start barking. She demanded that I admit what I had done, that I explain how her once perfect lawn had transformed into what she dramatically called a swamp of despair. I leaned on the broom and listened, keeping my expression as calm as I could manage. When she paused for breath, I gestured toward the pipe sticking out from behind her hedge. It was visible to anyone passing by, dripping and hissing like a guilty confession. I told her that maybe her handmade irrigation system had developed a personality of its own. Maybe it simply decided it was tired of flooding my yard and wanted to visit hers for a change. Her face turned crimson. She stomped her foot like a child, denied candy, and shouted that I was mocking her. I didn't deny it. The truth was too obvious for polite words. Neighbors peeked through their curtains, some even stepping out onto porches to catch the show. Karen's tirade grew louder the more she realized she had an audience. She waved her arms at my house, at my porch, at my driveway, claiming I was an enemy of the community, that I was a threat to property values, that I was everything wrong with the neighborhood. What she didn't seem to notice was the way the crowd reacted. Heads shook, a few chuckles slipped out, and someone even clapped quietly when she demanded that I hire a professional exorcist for her drainage problem. She had crossed from authority figure to spectacle without realizing it. The harder she yelled, the weaker her case became. I stayed quiet after that, letting her voice echo against the houses until she finally stormed back inside, still muttering about curses and conspiracies. Her meltdown hadn't fixed her swamp, but it had done something better. It showed everyone else exactly how unhinged she had become, and for the first time, I wasn't the one under her microscope. When Karen realized her screaming fits weren't stopping the water, she shifted her strategy to what she knew best. She called for an emergency HOA meeting. Flyers appeared in mailboxes overnight, printed in bold letters, warning of a neighborhood crisis that threatened property values and community harmony. The way she framed it, you would think I had set fire to her garden instead of redirecting the water she had unleashed on me. By the time the evening arrived, half the neighborhood had gathered in the community hall, folding chairs lined up under the harsh fluorescent lights. Karen marched to the front like a politician ready for a rally. She had charts, photographs, and a binder so thick it looked like she had been preparing this case for months. She slammed it onto the table and announced that she had irrefutable proof that I had engaged in deliberate sabotage. She showed pictures of her flooded yard, conveniently cropped so the pipe behind her hedge never made an appearance. She paced the room, her voice rising with each accusation, insisting that my actions endangered the neighborhood's infrastructure and set a dangerous precedent for everyone's property rights. When my turn came to respond, I walked to the front carrying a small bucket. Inside was the foul swamp water I had scooped from her lawn only hours earlier. I placed it on the table next to her pristine binder and began laying out my evidence. I showed photos taken from my yard, complete with time, stamps, clearly displaying the pipe protruding from her hedge and the water streaming across the property line. I presented a simple diagram of how her system worked, highlighting the connection she had created to the main line and the way it funneled directly onto my land. The room grew quieter with every page I turned. Neighbors leaned forward, murmuring as they compared Karen's selective photographs with the full picture I displayed. Someone in the back even laughed when I pointed out the crude fittings and duct tape that made up her so-called irrigation design. By the time I finished, the smug certainty in Karen's face had drained away. The board members shifted uncomfortably, caught between their loyalty to Karen and the undeniable evidence in front of them. For the first time, I saw cracks in her authority. She hadn't expected me to come prepared, and she certainly hadn't expected the truth to look so convincing. The moment I finished presenting my evidence, a few neighbors who had stayed quiet for months finally raised their hands. One man spoke up about how his flower beds had mysteriously flooded last spring, ruining the tulips his wife had planted. Another neighbor mentioned how their backyard often smelled like mildew, even though their own irrigation system was brand new. The more people shared, the clearer it became that I wasn't the only one Karen had targeted. A woman from 2 streets over recalled how water had pooled along her fence line until the wood began to rot. She said she never thought to connect it back to Karen, but now the pieces made sense. Someone else mentioned their basement sump pump working overtime whenever Karen's sprinklers were running, a detail that drew murmurs of recognition from several others. It felt like a puzzle snapping together in real time, with each neighbor adding another piece to the picture. Karen sat stiffly in her chair, clutching her binder as if it could shield her from the growing tide of complaints. Her voice, usually sharp and commanding, wavered when she tried to dismiss the accusations. She claimed it was all coincidence, that the neighborhood's drainage had always been faulty, that she was simply the scapegoat because she had the courage to enforce rules. But the more she spoke, the less convincing she sounded. What struck me most was the shift in the room. For years, people had tiptoed around Karen, nodding along to her lectures and paying fines just to avoid her wrath. Now, with evidence laid out and stories piling up, the fear that had kept everyone quiet was breaking down. You could see it in their faces, the relief of finally realizing they weren't alone, that the bully who had controlled the neighborhood was vulnerable. By the end of the meeting, Karen wasn't the authority figure anymore. She was the defendant, sitting under a spotlight of collective judgment. The board members avoided her gaze, neighbors whispered openly about consequences, and for the first time since I moved in, I felt the weight of her control lifting. She had spent years convincing everyone she was untouchable, but the cracks in her throne were spreading faster than the water in her yard. Within a week of the meeting, Karen's backyard had transformed into something no landscaper could have salvaged. What was once her manicured pride had collapsed into a damp ecosystem that seemed to grow wilder by the day. Mosquitoes were the first invaders, rising in clouds whenever anyone walked past her fence. Their high-pitched buzzing followed people down the sidewalk, forcing parents to rush their kids inside and neighbors to slap at their arms as if they were trekking through a swamp instead of strolling through suburbia. The insects brought friends. Frogs appeared next, drawn by the standing pools that spread wider with each rainfall. Their croaks filled the evenings, echoing through the cul-de-sac like a chorus no one had asked for. Birds swooped down to hunt the mosquitoes, and even ducks were spotted waddling through the flooded patches of her lawn. The neighborhood, once proud of its tidy hedges and clipped lawns, now had a bizarre attraction that belonged in a wildlife reserve. Karen tried to keep up appearances at first. She lit citronella candles and placed store-bought repellents around the yard, as if a few sprays could hold back the tide. But the effort was futile. The pests multiplied faster than she could swat them, and her patio, once her favorite stage for sipping tea and issuing commands, became uninhabitable. She retreated indoors, leaving her fortress of order to crumble while the swamp creatures claimed it inch by inch. From my porch, I watched the neighbors' reactions shift. At first, there had been quiet amusement, whispered jokes about karma and poetic justice. Soon, the laughter faded into annoyance, then outright frustration. Families complained about the mosquito bites, about pets dragging mud into their houses, about the noise that made it hard to sleep with the windows open. For years, Karen had lorded over the neighborhood, dictating every detail of everyone else's property. Now, her own yard had become the source of misery for everyone around her, and no one was willing to come to her defense. Each evening, as the frogs sang and the mosquitoes swarmed under the streetlights, I felt the balance of power settle more firmly in place. The swamp wasn't just hers anymore. It had become the neighborhood's reminder that control, once lost, is rarely regained. The smell arrived before most people even realized how bad the flooding had become. At first, it was just a faint sourness in the air, something you might mistake for damp leaves or wet mulch. But within days it thickened into a stench that clung to clothes and lingered in your nose long after you left the area. Walking down the street past Karen's house felt like stepping behind a dumpster on a hot day. The combination of standing water, decaying plants, and fertilizer runoff brewed into a sour cocktail that drifted across the block. Neighbors began avoiding the sidewalk altogether, crossing to the opposite side of the street with their hands pressed over their faces. Children complained about the smell when they played outside, and more than one family canceled plans to host backyard barbecues because the odor carried so far. What had once been a showpiece corner lot was now a rotting reminder of negligence. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who remembered how often Karen had lectured about property values and neighborhood standards. The stench seeped indoors, too. On humid evenings, when she opened her windows to air out the house, the smell only intensified. It curled through her curtains and settled into the fabric of her furniture. I could see her standing on her porch, spraying air freshener into the breeze, as if she could mask the swamp with lavender mist. But nothing worked. The odor overpowered every attempt. For me, the transformation was surreal. I could sit on my porch, breathing clean air, while only a few feet away, her yard reeked like a neglected sewage ditch. It was the kind of shift you couldn't plan, the kind of poetic balance nature seems to deliver all on its own. Karen had spent years policing the smallest details, fining neighbors for trash cans left at the curb or lawns cut a day too late, and now she was the source of the single worst blight the neighborhood had ever endured. The smell did more than ruin her reputation. It created distance. Friends who used to linger on her porch stopped visiting. Delivery drivers dropped packages at the edge of her walkway and hurried back to their trucks. Every day the odor grew stronger, and every day her standing in the community sank with it. One morning, a landscaping crew rolled up in a truck full of equipment, the kind of heavy-duty gear you usually see when a golf course is being repaired. Karen had finally called in reinforcements. She stood at the curb with her arms crossed, directing the workers as if she were orchestrating a rescue mission. For a moment, I thought she might actually pull it off. They unloaded pumps, shovels, and rolls of fresh sod, marching across her property with the confidence of men who had handled tough jobs before. That confidence evaporated as soon as they stepped into the yard. Their boots sank deep into the soggy ground, water splashing around their ankles with every move. One worker muttered something to another, shaking his head as he tried to drive a shovel into the mud, only for it to stick like glue. Another man tested the soil near the patio, only to pull back with a grimace when the ground shifted under his weight. It wasn't just wet, it was unstable. Karen barked orders, demanding that they keep going, but the crew was already exchanging looks. They tried laying sand to firm up the worst areas, but it disappeared into the muck as fast as they poured it. Pumps they set up sputtered and clogged, unable to keep up with the constant seepage. Within an hour, the men were covered in mud, their equipment coated, their patience thinning. Karen's voice grew louder, her tone sharper, but it didn't change the reality in front of them. Finally, the foreman approached her with a clipboard, his expression a mix of sympathy and irritation. He explained in plain words that her yard wasn't just flooded, it had become a wetland. No amount of new sod or decorative gravel was going to solve the problem. The source of the water had to be addressed first, and until then, any landscaping would be a waste of time and money. Karen's face turned bright red as she argued, insisting that they fix it anyway. But the crew packed up, loaded their tools back onto the truck, and drove off without another word. She was left standing in the driveway, mud splattered across her slippers, clutching her clipboard of complaints as if it could hold her yard together. From my porch, I couldn't help but feel a wave of satisfaction. Even the professionals had walked away from her mess. Karen's desperation reached a level that bordered on comedy the day she decided to involve the police. I was trimming the edges of my newly drying lawn when the sound of sirens drifted faintly down the street. Moments later, a patrol car slowed to a stop in front of her house. Karen rushed out the door, waving her arms like she was flagging down an ambulance. Her voice carried so clearly that I didn't even need to strain to hear. She was reporting a suspicious flooding situation that she claimed was being orchestrated by me. The officer stepped carefully out of his car, adjusting his belt as he surveyed the scene. His boots sank into the mud as he followed Karen into her yard, and the look on his face said everything. He wasn't witnessing a crime, he was witnessing a disaster of her own making. Karen pointed dramatically toward my house, spinning a story about sabotage and harassment, insisting that I had somehow cursed her irrigation system. When the officer approached me, his tone was polite but skeptical. He asked if I had made any adjustments to her property. I shook my head and gestured toward the pipe system behind her hedge, explaining that her drainage setup had been in place long before my involvement. I showed him the photos I had already collected, neatly organized on my phone, documenting the steady stream that had ruined my yard. The officer scrolled through the pictures, nodded once, and handed the phone back. His expression remained calm, but the sigh he let out carried the weight of someone who had been dragged into neighborhood drama too many times before. He turned to Karen and explained that property disputes like this were a civil matter, not a criminal one. If she had plumbing problems, she needed to call a licensed contractor. If she believed I had damaged her system, she could take it to small claims court. Karen sputtered in disbelief, her arms flailing as she insisted that he arrest me. The officer simply stepped back toward his car, brushing mud from his boots. As he drove away, leaving Karen shouting at the empty street, I realized she had finally crossed into territory where even law enforcement wouldn't entertain her delusions. She had officially called the cops on herself. The sight of a white city truck pulling into the cul-de-sac a few days later sent a ripple of curiosity through the neighborhood. The bold lettering on the side read, Department of Water and Utilities, and the man stepping out wore the kind of reflective vest that meant business. He carried a clipboard under one arm and a tool bag in the other. Karen hurried down her walkway to meet him, speaking in rapid bursts and pointing toward my house, as though she had summoned reinforcements to finally bring me down. The inspector listened for a moment before stepping carefully into her yard. His boots sank into the mud, and he frowned as he scanned the ground. He knelt near the hedge where the pipe protruded, brushing soil away to reveal the crude fittings. His pen scratched across the clipboard as he muttered about tampering and illegal connections. Karen hovered at his side, nodding as if she had orchestrated the entire inspection, completely oblivious to the fact that the evidence in front of him pointed squarely at her. I watched from my porch as he followed the line back to its source. He crouched again, tapped the joint with his wrench, and shook his head. When he straightened, he called Karen over and explained loud enough for half the block to hear. The connection into the city's water main was unauthorized, unstable, and potentially dangerous. He told her that what she had built was a direct violation of municipal codes and carried significant penalties. Karen's posture changed instantly. The confidence drained from her as quickly as the water spilling across her yard. She stammered excuses, insisting she had hired someone else to do the work, that she thought it was a legitimate improvement, that the system had somehow altered itself. The inspector wasn't swayed. He took photographs, marked locations with orange flags, and handed her a notice requiring immediate correction. By the time he left, Karen stood frozen at the curb clutching the paperwork, her slippers stained with mud and her expression pale. The neighborhood buzzed with whispers, phones out to capture the scene. For once, the spotlight she had always craved had turned into a floodlight, illuminating every corner of her scheme. She had wanted official validation, and she had gotten it, but not in the way she expected. The inspector's visit left a ripple that carried through the neighborhood faster than any rumor Karen had ever spread. Word got out that tampering with a city water main wasn't just frowned upon, but classified as a criminal offense. The document he handed her wasn't a polite warning. It was an official citation, stamped and dated, outlining fines that could climb into the thousands and the possibility of legal action if she didn't comply immediately. Neighbors whispered about the penalties, about the kind of charges people faced for interfering with municipal systems. The gossip had a sharp edge of satisfaction, a sense that karma had finally moved from theory to practice. Karen, of course, tried to spin the story. The next day, she stood in her driveway, addressing anyone who would listen, insisting she had been framed. She claimed I had planted the pipe, that I had somehow altered her yard in secret to make her look guilty. But the paperwork told a different story, and so did the photographs taken by the inspector. Those images were already part of the official record, attached to her citation and circulating quietly among neighbors who had asked to see them. The panic showed in her eyes even as she raised her voice. She knew what it meant when the city got involved. This wasn't the HOA, where she could manipulate meetings and sway decisions with her shrill persistence. This was municipal law, backed by regulations she couldn't bend or reinterpret. For once, her binder of neighborhood rules meant nothing. Watching her shuffle the paperwork in her hands, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The months of harassment, the endless complaints, the destruction of my lawn, all of it had led to this moment, where she was finally held accountable. I didn't need to argue with her anymore. I didn't need to raise my voice. The evidence was on record, and the consequences were hers alone. That evening, the cul-de-sac felt lighter. Families lingered on their porches longer than usual. Kids rode their bikes in wide circles, and conversations flowed without the usual glance over the shoulder to see if Karen was watching. Her empire of control had shrunk to a single muddy yard and a stack of fines she could not argue away. For the first time since moving in, I felt like the neighborhood belonged to everyone again, not just the woman who had tried to flood me into submission. Karen's fury only grew after the inspector left, and by the weekend, she had erupted into what could only be described as a full-scale meltdown. I was on my porch, tightening a loose railing, when I heard her voice rise above the usual hum of the neighborhood. She was pacing across her patio, phone in hand, shouting about conspiracies and how the city was working with me to destroy her. Her words carried clear enough that neighbors emerged from their houses just to watch the spectacle. She alternated between frantic phone calls and screaming tirades directed at no one in particular. One moment she was promising to call her lawyer, the next she was threatening to sue the HOA, the city, and even the landscaping crew that had abandoned her. She insisted she had proof that I had cursed her water line, that I had manipulated records, that I was part of a shadowy plan to steal her home. Each claim was more bizarre than the last, and each one chipped away at the little credibility she still had. At one point, she marched into the street and began yelling at the top of her lungs about property values, waving the inspector's citation papers as if they were evidence of her persecution. Passing cars slowed, drivers craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the woman ranting in her slippers, with mud splattered up her legs. Some neighbors filmed quietly from their porches, shaking their heads and whispering about how far she had spiraled. When she finally turned her attention back to me, she screamed accusations so wild they barely made sense. She claimed I had bribed the city, that I was hiding secret machinery under my lawn, that I had orchestrated the flooding in her yard with advanced technology. I leaned against my porch railing, arms folded, letting her words echo without reaction. Every calm silence on my part only seemed to fuel her anger. By the time the sun dipped low, her voice had grown hoarse and her pacing had slowed. She retreated inside, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. The cul-de-sac fell quiet again, but the memory of her public breakdown lingered. It was no longer just me who saw her as unstable. The entire neighborhood had witnessed the unraveling of the authority she once held, and there was no binder thick enough to repair the damage she had done to herself. Not long after her meltdown, the neighborhood decided to reclaim a little peace. It started with my next-door neighbor, Bob, who suggested we host a small barbecue in his yard to remind everyone that this street belonged to more than just Karen's chaos. Word spread quickly, and by Saturday evening the smell of grilled burgers and ribs drifted through the air. Families brought lawn chairs, kids tossed footballs in the street, and laughter echoed where tension had once hung heavy. It felt like a declaration that her reign of fear was finally broken. From my porch I could see Karen standing at her window, arms folded tight against her chest as she peered out at the gathering. Her swampy yard bubbled quietly under the glow of the streetlights, a reminder that she was no longer the one in control. Every cheer from the kids and every burst of laughter from the adults seemed to make her shoulders stiffen. Someone set up a portable speaker, and soon music filled the cul-de-sac. The sound carried directly toward her house, and it wasn't long before a few of the kids wandered close to her property line, pointing at the ducks that had taken over her flooded flower beds. Their giggles turned the scene into a sideshow. It was surreal watching nature reclaim her yard while the rest of us enjoyed burgers and potato salad just a few feet away. At one point, Bob raised his glass and made a small toast, thanking everyone for coming together. He didn't mention Karen by name, but no one needed him to. The meaning was clear. We were standing as a neighborhood again, united in laughter and community instead of fear of fines or violation slips. The swamp in her yard had become a backdrop for our celebration, a living symbol of how quickly power can shift when people stand together. Karen never came outside. She hovered behind her curtains, occasionally snapping them shut when she realized she had been spotted. The party stretched late into the night, with neighbors lingering under string lights and children chasing fireflies. It was the kind of evening I had hoped for when I first moved in, and it felt even sweeter knowing that her attempt to isolate me had ended with her isolating herself. The HOA could only ignore the situation for so long. After weeks of complaints from frustrated residents about mosquitoes, foul smells, and sinking fences, they finally called a special meeting. The board gathered in the community hall with clipboards and bottled water, trying to look composed while a line of neighbors waited to speak. Karen arrived early, clutching her binder of rules, her chin high as if she still believed she could command the room. She chose a seat at the front, tapping her foot impatiently, clearly expecting the meeting to turn into another opportunity to scold the community. The mood shifted quickly once the testimonies began. One neighbor described how their child had come home covered in mosquito bites after playing near her property. Another explained that the smell from her yard had become so unbearable that they could no longer use their back patio. A retired couple held up photos of their fence leaning at a sharp angle after weeks of soil erosion caused by water spilling from her swamp. Each account was more damning than the last, and murmurs of agreement rippled through the hall. When it was my turn, I calmly laid out the evidence once more. I presented the inspector's report, photographs of the illegal connection, and documentation of the damage to my property. I didn't raise my voice or embellish. The facts alone were enough. By the time I finished, the board members were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, their earlier loyalty to Karen evaporating under the weight of undeniable proof. Karen tried to defend herself, claiming she had been targeted, framed, and harassed by jealous neighbors. She waved her binder like a shield, quoting rules about landscaping and aesthetics as if they mattered more than the citation from the city sitting on the table in front of her. But no one was listening anymore. Her voice, once sharp enough to silence a room, now rang hollow. The board announced their decision before the meeting ended. Karen would be fined heavily for repeated violations and reckless behavior. Her privileges as a senior HOA member were suspended indefinitely, and she was ordered to cover the costs of repairs required to address the damage caused by her flooding. The announcement drew a collective sigh of relief from the room. For the first time, the HOA had turned against their golden girl, and her empire of intimidation began to crumble in front of everyone. The last time I saw her standing in her yard, the image burned into my memory like the final scene of a play. She was knee-deep in the swamp she had created, a bucket in one hand and a garden rake in the other, shouting at the ducks that had claimed her property. Her once perfect flower beds were buried under murky water, the mulch floating like driftwood, while frogs leapt from stone to stone as if mocking her. She swung the rake wildly, trying to shoo the birds away, but each flap of their wings only stirred the water and splashed mud across her legs. Her patio furniture was half submerged, the cushions stained and sagging from weeks of dampness. The bird bath leaned even further, now serving as a perch for mosquitoes instead of sparrows. The air carried that same sour odor that had driven neighbors indoors for so long, heavy and clinging. Yet she stood in the middle of it all, refusing to surrender, shouting about how the neighborhood was against her, how she was the victim of a vast conspiracy. The ducks paid her no mind, gliding across the pools of water with an ease that made her rage look even more absurd. I watched from my porch, coffee in hand, taking in the spectacle with a mixture of disbelief and satisfaction. This was the woman who had once lectured me about property values, who had stood on her porch with smug superiority while my yard drowned. Now she was flailing in the mess she had engineered, powerless against the natural consequences of her own actions. Neighbors walked past quietly, some shaking their heads, others smiling faintly as they captured photos from a distance. Her words were no longer sharp commands. They were desperate cries, carried off by the wind and ignored by everyone she had once controlled. The ducks splashed again, sending ripples through the water at her feet, and she screamed at them to leave her property. But the property was no longer hers in spirit. It belonged to the swamp, to the creatures that had found sanctuary in her negligence, to the story that would be told long after she retreated indoors. Watching her sink further into the muck, I realized her reign was over. Nature had delivered the final judgment, and it had done so with poetic precision. And that's how my HOA Karen turned my lawn into a swamp, only to end up living in one herself. If you're still watching without double-checking your backyard for suspicious pipes, congratulations, you're braver than me. Remember, neighbors like Karen will always try to flood your peace, but sometimes the current flows right back where it belongs. Smash that subscribe button for more tales of entitled chaos meeting poetic justice. Drop your own Karen water war stories in the comments. Trust me, it's cheaper than therapy. And until next time, may your lawn stay dry, your sprinklers stay legal, and your neighbors stay far, far away from your water main.